Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Sad news to report on the passing of civil rights legend, Black Power icon, civil rights activist, and a very controversial figure in American history, Assata Shakur, aka Joanne Chesimard. She passed away today at the age of 78 in Havana, Cuba. She led a very interesting life. Hey, Lisa, what's going on? She led a very interesting life. She was born in Flushing, Queens, New York. Um, she moved to different. Hey, David, what's going on? She moved to different places around in the Northeast with her family. Originally, her family was from Wilmington, North Carolina, which anybody that knows anything about Wilmington, North Carolina, knows that in the 1880s, Wilmington, North Carolina was uh, one of the one of the areas that was hit by a race riot in which several people died in the time when race riots were pretty popular. We know about the Tulsa, but there's other ones. There's Elaine, Arkansas. There's Wilmington, North Carolina. There's Ocoee, Florida. There's Rosewood, Florida. The YouTuber Sergeant Willie Pete, SWP, goes over them all the time. But her family was originally from there before moving to New York. She, it's not till she um, is in college that she encounters, uh, Black liberation theology or Marxism, communism. In 1964, she went to the Borough of Manhattan Community College, BMCC, and it's here where she heard a debate about the Vietnam War, and she realized that her as a black woman has a lot more in common with the Vietnamese, the oppressed Vietnamese of the world, than the American oppressor. And it is here when she joins a group called the Black Liberation Army, the BLA. And what the BLA was basically an offshoot of the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, founded in 1966 as a by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale as a way to protect. Well, originally it was founded in Merritt University in California as a way to protest the lack of black studies in that particular college, but eventually became a civil defense force for the black community all around the country, basically protecting the black community. It was like, the use of armed struggle. Many of the Black Panthers subscribed to Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism in particular. They were even invited to China and to Cuba and to Algiers. Algeria at this time was a hotbed of leftist revolutionary type government, and of course, these individuals were welcome. So the BLA, the group that she was a part of, and the Republic of New Africa group was very similar. Um, in the late 60s, she was arrested because she chained herself to the faculty doors in protest of the lack of black faculty, as well as an emphasis on a lack of emphasis on black studies. It was during this time that she changed her name to Asada Shakur. Shakur means to be loved, and Assata is a West African version of the Arabic name uh, Aisha, because she said that she didn't feel like Joanne anymore. She didn't feel like an American anymore. She felt, more at home with her African roots, and this was common, in the late '60s and early '70s for many in the the Black community, the African American community, because the civil rights movements, it proved to be a success in a sense because they had the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, but that was legal integration. People wanted something more. They wanted cultural integration, and it wasn't. The mainstream civil rights movement wasn't really delivering fast enough on the promises of equality. So, with all that's going on, with the liberation of the third world, with the Cold War going on, and many oppressed groups around the world, Africans, Asians, and others, struggling with against the spirit of imperialism, against French imperialism, Dutch imperialism, Belgian imperialism, English imperialism. African Americans, Black people here, felt common kinship with them, and she was one of them. You know what I mean? So, but and because of this, the Cold War going on, so the United States government begins to track different Black groups, different Black liberation groups, and other types of leftist groups in an initiative called COINTELPRO, initiated by the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who was good friends with the president at that time, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Right? There's a movie about him starring Leonardo DiCaprio as him. Initially, he was supposed to go after the mob, the mafia, because that was the MO of the Kennedy administration of tackling organized crime, right? But the mafia had some blackmailing photos on him. He was gay, right? He was gay at a time when you could not be gay. You know what I mean? When it was heavily stigmatized to be gay. So the mafia blackmailed him. They threatened to put these photos out of him, right? And then he cross-dressed and everything. And he backed off the mafia and began to target Black groups, began to target the Black Panthers, began to target Martin Luther King's group, the SPLC, and the Nation of Islam, and the Puerto Rican Liberation Group, the Young Lords, which was affiliated with the Black Panthers, right? And all these other groups, the Symbionese Liberation Army, the BLA, all these groups, and began to basically get these trumped up charges on them. And in her case in particular, she had bank robbery cases in Queens. She had other cases that they were coming out against her for. But the biggest one is in 1973. Supposedly, she engaged in a shootout with a New Jersey state trooper who went by the name of hold on, guys. Uh, Warren Foster, right? And it resulted in his death. She was with another gentleman who was her boyfriend at the time, Sundata Akoli, another member of the group, and supposedly went to trial later in the 70s. And supposedly, they said she did it, but and she was convicted. She went to jail. She served in Virginia, and she served. It was in Virginia where she met some really interesting characters. When she was serving there, she met um, Lalita Labron, who was the one of the founding mothers of the Puerto Rican Liberation Group, the Machaderos, because Puerto Rico at that time too was fighting for independence from the United States. Heavily leftist groups. She met two women, the Shrieky From and another woman that in the Manson family. There were two of Manson's, Charles Manson's girls there that were also incarcerated when she was in Virginia. But pretty soon, by the mid 70s, she manages to escape. I mean, not by the late 70s, by 1979 she manages to escape. This offshoot of the Black Liberation Army called the Family help her to escape along with her lawyer, who is named William Kunstler. Helps her to escape, and by the 1980s, 1979, Lisa, yeah, my mistake, not the mid 70s, the late 70s, 1979. You're right. Um, she manages to escape, and she makes it to Cuba, and she spends the rest of her life in Cuba as an exile in Cuba, where in the late 80s she publishes her book Assata, which I never have read. I've never read it. I've always been interested in reading it, but I never could find it available. I finally purchased it on Audible. Angela Davis, who does the forward, so I'll probably be reviewing it once I'm finished with it. It's a pretty cool book. There's a lot said about it. You know what I mean? About her side of the story. Her side of what happened that day in May of 1973 when she engaged in a shootout with um, that individual. But she became the most wanted woman in the history of the United States. You know what I mean? And given Cuba's relationship with the United States, if somebody from Cuba decides to leave the United States, leave Cuba to come to the United States will protect them. Like say Elian Gonzalez, for example, right, or the Mariel Boatlift refugees. But the opposite is also true. If an individual that is you know decides to renounce his or her American citizenship and want to live in Cuba, you know, Cuba will protect them also. Given that the two countries don't have diplomatic relations because of years of the embargo that we always talk about on this channel, you know, Cuba doesn't have to give them up. Now in 2015, her name resurfaces again because during that time, President Barack Obama, I don't know if you remember this, Lisa, President Obama decides that he's going to, right before Fidel Castro passed away, he's going to open up diplomatic relations with Cuba again. And Republican politicians, particularly of her state, not of her state, but the state where it happened, New Jersey, Chris Christie at the time, was pressuring Barack Obama to get the Cuban government to give her up so she could serve time in American prisons as a fugitive and not a refugee. Needless to say, that did not happen. Um, Cuba did not cave to the pressure, and she remained in Cuba for the rest of her life. Now, interestingly enough, the name is not just coincidental. She has a relationship with Tupac. She was Tupac's godmother. Um, so, right, godmother and step aunt of Tupac Shakur. Exactly, Lisa's correct. Sorry, guys. Yeah, she is related to him through his stepfather Mutulu. Now, Mutulu Shakur, people know who he is. If people don't know. In 1971, a group of Black Panthers called the Panther 21 were accused of trying to blow up a police station, plotting to blow up a police station. And Tupac's father, Mutulu, was involved with this. So, um, you know, but the conspiracy theory that developed around Tupac, a conspiracy theory developed around Tupac's death after Tupac's death in 1996, that he actually did not die, that he went to Cuba to live with Assata. and then he's been living in Cuba ever since. Then nobody in his family has ever um, lent credence to this. His stepbrother Mopreme, his mom Afeni, when she was alive, didn't lend credence to this. Nobody's ever confirmed this. But hypothetically, if this were true, Eminem even alluded to it in one of his freestyles. He said in one of his freestyles, he goes, "Hip hop ain't been the same since Tupac moved to Cuba on us." But if this were true, well, well, the Cuban government wouldn't give him up either. You know what I'm saying? So we will never really know. But she's an absolute legend in the world of Black consciousness because she was branded as a modern day escaped slave. Hey, if you consider the American system of government, the capitalist system of government, that America perpetuates as a slave society, in its treatment of black individuals, indigenous individuals. I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying if you consider that to be that as an approximation, like many of these groups did, Black Panthers, BLA, if you consider uh, that to be the case, then yeah, she is like a modern day escaped slave because she escaped to a freer country, a more equitable country. Because basically, what many people don't realize is that the Cuban Revolution in 1959 had a lot to do with race and skin color because before 1959, Cuban society was not only heavily controlled by the American mafia, but it was also heavily stratified on skin color, with lighter skinned Cubans at the top of the social ladder and darker skinned Afro Cubans at the bottom. So it had a lot to do with race, it heavily inspired similar groups here in the United States. You know what I mean? So obviously, it depends on your perspective, but I consider her to be a civil rights icon. I consider her to be a Black Power icon simply because, look, she refused to take shit. I mean, who knows? Uh, you don't have to look far to know that the United States government, the police forces, were targeting the Black Panther Party because the Black Panther Party and groups similar to it, their main objective was to fight against police brutality. Many people portray them as a black nationalist group. They think that they're a black nationalist group, that they're just black, quote unquote, racist. You know what I mean? That couldn't be further from the truth, guys. The Black Panther Party didn't care about race. You know what I mean? It was obviously a black group, but they were fighting for the equality and justice of all groups of disenfranchised people, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and even whites. Fred Hampton, who was assassinated in 1969 in Chicago, in his own bed, was fighting. Had the Rainbow Coalition of Puerto Rican groups like the Young Lords, Mexican groups like the Brown Berets, and even white groups like the Young Patriots. You know what I mean? So for the Black Panthers, it was never about black nationalism. It was never about race. It was about you know economics. The poor versus the rich. It was basically a Marxist Leninist group. It can't. There are black nationalist groups. Uh, Ron Karenga's group, the United Slave Society, which was like an enemy, an op group of the Black Panthers. They were kind of more race centric, but the Black Panthers really wasn't that. You know what I mean? They were proud of their African heritage, but they fought for the liberation of all people, right? You know what I mean? So when the media, particularly conservatives in the media, try to portray them as like this equivalent to the KKK. First of all, there's no black equivalent to the KKK at all because um, even the black nationalist groups, even the UNIA, Marcus Garvey's group, or groups like the Nation of Islam or the Hebrew Israelites or the Moorish Science Temple, even these type of groups that are explicitly black nationalist groups, or Ron Karenga's group, they didn't go around hunting white people. They didn't go around beating white people up. They didn't go around burning African symbols in white people's yards, right? They didn't go around doing that. There's no equivalent to that in in any black nationalist circles. So there's no such thing as a black KKK, even among the hardcore black nationalist groups. But the Black Panthers, like I said, they weren't that. They were fighting against police brutality. Mainly their targets were police officers, corrupt police officers. That's where you get the slang word for cops, pigs, right? They come right out of the 1965 Watts Rebellion, right? They come right out of the Berkeley, and that's why they were so scared. They were the scariest ones out of everybody that um, uh, J. Edgar Hoover was targeting, because they had appealed to white kids as well. They had appealed to everybody. You know what I mean? They didn't just have appeal to just black kids. They had appeal across the economic spectrum of black people, right? And across the economic spectrum of white people. They had Leonard Bernstein, one of the writers of West Side Story, was one of their supporters, right? So, and we talked about in the movie Crip Camp, Lisa and I did, that they helped out disabled people, helping in the activism to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? The Black Panthers. So people have this wrong notion of groups like the one she was in and Black Panthers, that they think that's just the black version of the KKK. Again, there's no such thing as the black version of the KKK. Maybe in rhetoric, maybe, but in actuality, in actual things that they do, no, there's no equivalent to that, right? But even in rhetoric, the Panthers weren't that. You know what I mean? Conservatives just target them because they are, they had their philosophy was Marxist Leninist. Their philosophy was anti-capitalist. Because early on, the Panthers rejected black capitalism. They rejected groups like the Nation of Islam, groups like the UNIA, because they viewed that as black capitalism. Those groups were focused on businesses. Those groups were focused on entrepreneurship, basically being a parody or a black version of the capitalist system, the conservative capitalist system. The Panthers and groups like the one she was in, they rejected that notion. They rejected capitalism altogether. They rejected that type of mentality. They would view that type of mentality on the black spectrum as right wing, whereas they would view themselves as left wing. You know what I mean? Because they were more collectivist, more socialist in their mindset than those other groups that were more capitalist oriented. So outright they rejected that from the beginning. But they did draw inspiration from Malcolm X, who, uh, you know, died in 1965. But more his later stuff when he began to be involved with like Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria and the Cubans and the Maoists. Chairman Mao Zedong, who was the communist leader in China at the time, even invited them to meet with him. You know what I mean? So, the Panthers was something different. I'm currently I'm listening to rather, besides her book, I'm listening to another book about the Black Panthers because in school we didn't really learn about the Black Panthers, you know, at all because for some reason that's and we definitely didn't learn about BLA or the Symbian Liberation Army or any of these other groups, Republic of New Africa. We didn't learn any about these groups because these groups The most we learned about the civil rights movement was the SBLC, Martin Luther King's group, and maybe a little bit about Malcolm X, but divorced from what Malcolm X actually believed in or actually taught. You know what I mean? Like these icons of the Black Power era of the civil rights movement are not taught at all. You know what I mean? So I encourage you guys to get our book, Rest in Peace to Her, you know, peace and liberation and power to the people and all that stuff. You know what I mean? To her, and condolences to her family. She was somebody who really defied the system, you know, and really came out on top. Thanks, guys. Peace. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing. Thank you, David, too.